Hey, everybody, welcome to Scoop. I'm so glad you're here today. We got a bunch of really interesting news to get to, and I think a great way to get you started on a whole new week where there's a lot of potential things happening on the horizon. And that's going to be the case really over the next 3 weeks as we head towards the midterm elections. And the reality is that's always the case. There's always something on the horizon to watch, which is one of the reasons why being in the news business is interesting and why staying current is fun, and I hope this is a small part of that process for you. I have been thinking a lot about you over the last several days. You've really been on my mind. And this is true very often for me because I'm constantly thinking about, well, how can we deliver news better, more effectively? Obviously, that's one of the reasons why we launched Scoop. But I've also been having these random conversations with people about the news that sort of just happened. And that also gets me engaged. When you get into that deep conversation with someone about the news, how they're feeling about the news, that's happened with a few of us over direct messages, even as well, which I really enjoy. So you've really been on my mind. And then something happened, uh, kind of like a random story crossed my desk. And I'm going to bring these two things together and hopefully make you laugh because it made me laugh. And it also made me realize why I'm thinking about you in a different way than I have really over the last 4 or 5 years since I started Smarter News, since I left traditional media. So just over the last couple days, I actually had an anniversary I completely forgot. No, it's not a wedding anniversary, thank goodness, but it was the anniversary of my very first time on television. And that was the very first day of the Fox Business Network. So Fox News launched the Fox Business Network in 2007. And this, oh gosh, prepare for it. Just prepare for the hair and the lighting. If some of you are listening on podcasts, I encourage you to come and see the video because it's worth it. Because you're going to be like, oh my goodness, where did that hair come from? Let me tell you something. Over anything I did on the air for the first year, the number one thing that got the most attention was how I was doing my hair and how it was not done the right way. So I just want to own this. We eventually figured it out. I prefer the way that I'm talking to you now, a little bit more natural, a little bit less hairspray. Hairspray sales matter, by the way, which we'll get to in a second. That's going to be part of our broadcast. Don't worry, it's all going to come together. But this was the very first day that I was ever on television, and we did a broadcast at 5 a.m. This is my co-anchor, Nicole Petalides, who actually tweeted this out over the weekend. I would have totally missed this. This was 15 years ago. And Nicole was a great co-partner because she had been in the television business for some time. She was a mom, and she was so gracious to me, which really counts in this business because you need a good partner. And she was a great partner. And without her, I wouldn't have maybe gotten through. And I also wouldn't have remembered this date. But at 1 o'clock in the morning, October 15th, 2007, I walked out into the middle of the street in Manhattan and waved down a cab. That's how I got to the studio until the network realized it's probably not the safest thing if they actually want their anchors to show up. But that's what I did that day. And, it started off a journey. And I was thinking about that because in 2007, there was no way to anticipate so many things that happened in my life, but also happened in the news cycle. And this is how I was thinking about you this weekend. When we talk about an audience of people, we have an image, we have an image of an audience. I have an image of who you are. But I also think of you differently now than I did even last year or the year before because of what we've all collectively experienced together. I mean, think about what we have been through over the last several years, let alone the personal challenges that you have likely faced during that time. Just the big news events, everything from, the start of wars to the end of wars. We've been through massive economic turmoil. You've experienced a 100-year pandemic. I mean, you've had all these different things in front of you. You're experiencing one of the first wars in Europe since World War II. And so, as speaking to you as an audience, I want to both remind you of this, that you've been through a lot. Don't forget who you are, but also speak to you in a different way because you've been through a lot. And I know who you are. And you can handle a lot of different news happening at one time because you have over the last several years. And that's how I think the audience has really changed in news because there's always been that tone, right? The tone of news delivery that feels a little elitist, no matter who you're talking to, a little elitist, which is something I always want to avoid. And I don't think is good for the business or great customer service. But most importantly, look at what you've been through. So I'm meeting you at a level where I'm really respecting all that you've been through, everything that's taken place over the last couple of years. And now we're building upon that. And so you're not the same as the last couple of years. You are different. We're part of a developing story together. And I want to recognize what we've been through. So as we look out into the forecast of the midterm elections and the economy and what's going to happen with these different countries and what about nuclear conflict, let's just remember what we've been through. We've been through a lot. We can handle a lot. We're going to keep going. And so we're going to keep going today into the news. And I want to start with one of the biggest stories of our times, where you have a lot of people talking a lot about it, but not a lot of substance. And that's what I realized over the weekend when people were talking about the economy, because everyone's talking about the economy and inflation and oil prices and all this. But when I was searching for that great soundbite to share with you, I realized that people aren't really saying that much. Everyone's predicting something bad to happen, that potentially we are already in a recession or economic slowdown, or something worse is going to take place with the economy over the next several months. And I want to explain a little bit about why they're talking in this way and why there's also heightened attention on this. I don't like a lot of polls. They're not my thing. Why? Because polls are always backwards looking. They're a snapshot in time. You have anything take place over the next couple of weeks, the poll that you're seeing on your screen could change, which is a poll about what people really care about as the most important problem facing America. And so that could shift everything. So I don't think they're especially useful, although they tend to get a lot of attention. So you're not going to see me using a lot of polls until maybe right before the midterms, when maybe we could talk a little bit about what they're telling us or what they didn't tell us about the election. What I think is interesting about this particular poll that was highlighted by the New York Times was that it shows just how much the economy matters to everybody. If you look at the two top issues that Americans are saying are the most important problems facing America, they include the economy, the job market, the stock market, and and inflation. So two things that are economic related topics together at the very, very top. And then you see the rest of the topics that you might be hearing a ton about, depending on what sort of news sources you listen to: abortion, immigration, crime, gun policies. But we're talking about any of these other topics getting 5% of likely voters saying that this is the most important problem, or immigration as the most important problem, about 5%. So it's getting disproportionate amount of coverage, in part, by the way, because for the most part, American voters are divided along two party lines, with a very few in the middle that could switch one direction or the next. And the question is, for those very few in the middle, is the economy their biggest topic, or is it something else? And so that's why you're seeing some of these different topics really clung to by the different political parties to see, well, what is actually playing with that voter that could potentially be undecided. But let's talk a little bit about inflation and also what we're seeing in general. So I have a couple charts for you today, but this gives you an idea. If you're feeling like, man, I'm paying a lot more for things that I never did, the truth is, you are. Let me just read you one thing from Forbes. This gives you an idea. As you take a look at the graphic, you can see, like, fuel oil, for example, you're paying 60% more than you were last year at the same time. I mean, these prices are going up dramatically, 11% more for food. So here's the deal. Food prices are up 11%. Gasoline prices, so just gasoline that goes in your car, up 18%. Home heating fuel, that's where that fuel oil comes in, is projected to be 17% higher than last year. So all of these prices are going up. And the thing that's happened with the economy is that although we've seen inflation on the rise, and you've seen I went into the grocery store the other day. I'm going to have to do a little research on this. There was no iced tea, no unsweetened iced tea in my grocery store, which says a lot for Texas, where everyone drinks tea. Not just spills the tea, actually drinks the tea. There's nothing on the shelf. And so you kind of still wonder what's going on with the supply chain. What's happening with all of this? Why are prices still going up and we're still not seeing supplies of certain things? What's really going on with the economy? The thing is, even with the inflation data we got last week, and even with retail sales, guess what? You have hung in. The American consumer, despite all the pressures, everything you've been through over the last several years, let's bring this full circle, you've actually hung in. Yeah, you might be changing your habits a little bit. And we may actually see some of that this week. In fact, this week we get report cards from major companies. This is their earnings reports. These are big publicly traded companies. They have to come out to tell investors this is what's happening. When they do, it's pretty cool to look at what they think about the consumer, because they may notice things that we're doing that we're feeling, but they're actually putting numbers to it. So big companies like Procter and Gamble, speaking of hairspray, are you buying the hairspray? How much hairspray are you actually buying? Johnson and Johnson. We're talking about really big consumer good companies that are going to have to come forward and say, hey, this is what we're actually seeing And this is what it's doing to the company. So we may get some more insight. You may say to yourself, well, Jenna, I am hanging in, but it's getting harder. And this is where the key is. The question is, when does the American consumer really change their habits? And we really start seeing that in the data. And that's what everyone's watching for at this very moment in time, going into holiday season, which is so important for research, for any of these big companies and the research that we're going to see. It's not only going to be about, well, what do we know about the US economy over the next several months? It's also, well, what position are these companies in going into what we believe to be a slower economic period? So what determines a recession? I always think this talk about the recession is so interesting. Have you ever bought paint? You're just looking for gray paint, but like there's all these different hues that you have to choose. And so you may have gray paint that's called Dove gray, and then you may have gray paint that's called cappuccino, but it's still gray paint. Well, get this. When it comes to the economy, like it's still a slower economy. We may call it a recession. We may call it an economic slowdown. The bottom line is, no matter what anyone's calling this period, it's still slower than most people would like to see. And the graph that you're seeing on your screen sort of tells that picture. You can see at the beginning of the year, the first 3 months, the economy actually shrank. Our gross domestic product, what we're actually producing, shrank. And the following 3 months, that also happened. Not as bad, but still happened. And typically, when you have 2 consecutive quarters of a shrinking economy, that would be a recession. A recession is called by the National Bureau of Economic Research. So these are like it's a nonpartisan group that you get these real smart guys together, and they're going to tell us when there's an actual recession. They haven't done that yet because the job market still pretty solid, and the American consumer still pretty solid. Still, some are wondering if they should have already. And guess what? We're going to get another reading for the next 3-month period next week. And if that's also a negative reading, you're going to start hearing a lot of talk about a recession. So the bottom line here is you're hanging in. That's why people are not totally freaking out about the economy, but we're going to get a lot more information about the economy this week from these big companies, more economic data to come, and this will provide us some insight. Just remember, with any data you hear, this is true of political polls and it's true of data, it's always backwards looking. It's always a snapshot in time. So whatever we hear this week is really going to be looking backwards, and we have to also look forwards. America is the largest economy in the world. China follows quickly behind that. You have these 2 large economies where we're really watching leadership. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're seeing overseas with a couple of the big countries that we're really following this week and really are going to be following for the next several weeks. China being one of them. China is holding what they're calling as the Congress. We think of a Congress as a meeting of lawmakers that's taking place on a regular basis. For the Communist Party in China, by the way, China has the largest communist party in the entire world. This takes place every 5 years, and it's where leadership is really determined. And there was some question about whether or not President Xi, who's the current president in China, would maintain his position. But that seems to be the case. What we're going to be watching is, what is he saying? And also, who is he bringing with him to also lead China? What is that going to tell us? I thought this was a really interesting report. This was aired on CNBC. A journalist that's reporting from Asia was talking a little bit about what she noticed about what President Xi said this weekend. And I want you to take a listen and see if anything sounds slightly familiar to you when it comes to American politics. So just take a listen to this.
Andrew, well, in fact, President Xi said that making China great again is his central task for at least the next 5 years. In his 2-hour-long speech opening the party Congress on Sunday, he said that China's national rejuvenation would be underpinned by a Chinese-style modernization, and that modernization would continue to prioritize national security. And so to President Xi, that means self-reliance, tech supremacy, and military power that is, quote, normalized. Thanks, Andrew. Well, in fact, President Xi said that making China great again is his central task.
Make China great again. Have we heard that before? I think we've heard that before. When I heard that, I said, is that really true? That was an interesting quote. So this is what he's running on, right? Make China great again. We're going to normalize the military. We're going to take a stance where we're going to prioritize national security, potentially over growth, although we know that growth really matters for anybody in power. So we're going to continue to watch any headlines that are coming out of China, because this will give us an idea of what do the next 5 years look like? What are leaders talking about there? What are they prioritizing? And what does that say to us about what America is going to have to respond to? And so we'll continue to watch for headlines on that. In the meantime, I don't want to forget what's happening as well in Iran. And I want to kind of bring these two stories together because what we continue to watch in Iran are these ongoing protests. They're in their fifth week. Iran, as we know, is a state sponsor of terrorism, as listed as such by the United States, not a communist government, but you have a theocracy, an authoritarian regime, and you have the protests of people in the street protesting those in power. Over the weekend, there was a terrible fire at one of the most famous prisons in Iran. This is where high profile political prisoners are often held. Americans have been held, are being held in this facility. And it has a reputation for being obviously a very tough, dark place. So there was a fire there. There was chaos. This is continue. So you're getting a lot of chaos still in Iran and people continuing to protest. One of the questions that we have here that I think is important to watch at this time is protests can happen, but the question is, what is the change that the people want? Is there a leader that is going to emerge in Iran that could actually challenge those in power? Because the Ayatollah, as well as the president of Iran, they have an entire political structure around them. So if you look at other protests from other countries in the past, sometimes a leader will emerge and the people will coalesce around that leader and against those in power. We haven't seen that. There's not a name where I could say, guess what? Here's the name of this is a leader that's emerged that the people are getting behind. So if they overthrow those in power, this is who they're going to support. And I really want to watch for that. The other thing I really want to watch for is what are other countries going to do? Iran doesn't, has with the United States, we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran, but a lot of European nations do. And what is going to be the pressure coming from the world on Iran to not violently confront protests? When does that actually start putting more pressure from the outside to support the protesters? This is a question that's come up for the U.S. government as well. How can we do that? We don't have that instant phone line to those in power there. We don't have our American companies on the ground in Iran that we can suddenly shut down. Think about Russia and the sanctions that have been on Russia, where European and Western companies suddenly flooded out of Russia because of the war. We don't have that leverage. In fact, leverage is a big question about the United States and what we have. But support matters, and talking about the protests and lending our support to them, even publicly, matters. Former President Obama was talking a little bit about this weekend because when he first got into office, there were huge protests in the street in Iran. And there was a big question for this new president at the time about how he could support these protesters. It was a big debate, as you'll hear inside the White House. And I want you to listen to what he says, why there was a debate about what he should do, because we'll tie it to what we're actually watching now.
2010, you guys will recall, there was a big debate inside the White House about whether I should publicly affirm what was going on with the Green Movement, because a lot of the activists were being accused of being tools of the West, right. And there was some thought that we were somehow going to be undermining their street cred in Iran if I supported what they were doing. And in retrospect, I think that was a mistake. Every time we see a flash, a glimmer of hope, of people longing for freedom, I think we have to point it out. We have to shine a spotlight on it. We have to express some solidarity about it.
That was really insightful, because there was that question, well, why wouldn't the United States be more aggressive in supporting the protesters back in 2009? Why wouldn't we now? Well, you could hear about that hesitancy about, well, one of the things that the Iranian leadership is talking about is that these protests are actually just, basically stooges of the West. These aren't really Iranian people. These are people put up, paid for by the West and by Israel that are challenging the government. This is not real. This is what the Iranian regime is saying. And so that has to be part of the conversation inside the White House today, because obviously President Biden was vice president, or President Obama at the time. And you do have some crossover from people from that administration to this administration now. And I wonder, that would be a great question to ask. Well, what did we learn during that time that we're going to do different? What can we be doing behind the scenes? Is there anything we could be doing behind the scenes to continue to support these people that are fighting for freedom? Because in the end, it's hard to imagine this. We've talked about this a couple weeks ago. Sometimes it's easy to think, well, Iran will never have a change of leadership. It's always going to be what it is. It's always going to be a state sponsor of terrorism. But history proves that's not actually the case. You could see a change of leadership. Maybe you and I could be traveling to Iran sometime in the next several decades. Can you imagine that? Can't do it easily right now, but it could happen. And what would be beneficial to the West is not to have the current leadership. The United States will not talk about regime change. That's something that the US has been criticized globally about. It's trying to force regime change. Our leaders will not talk about that usually directly, but you have to think that there's a lot happening behind the scenes to try to support these protesters. One of the things I want to kind of tie in together, because we went to China, we're going to do a little bit about Iran, we're going to talk a little bit about Russia next, is something called the Arab Spring. So back in 2010, you could look at the Iranian protests in 2009 as maybe foreshadowing this, but back in 2010, it started with a protest in Tunisia and a protest for more rights. And eventually, the protests that we saw in Tunisia spread to other countries, like Egypt, for example, and other places around the Middle East, Bahrain. And you had Syria. You had these regimes suddenly getting pressure from the people for change. In some cases, it did lead to change. In other cases, it led to a violent crackdown, like in Syria. But protests, especially in a place like Iran, have the ability to inspire others around the world. In fact, we saw a protest banner being hung in China. You never see this, just as the Congress was meeting this weekend. And of course, we were also always watching protests in Russia. People gain fuel and momentum from other people. And so what's happening in Iran doesn't matter there. It matters as a model for other people that are also seeking freedom. And this is why we have to pay attention. So real quick here, let's go take it even one step further. We'll go to Russia, where in Ukraine, Russia's actually using Iranian drones. This relationship between China, Iran, and Russia is one to watch. The Chinese president once called Vladimir Putin his best friend. That actually happened just a few years ago. And you also see Russia with the relationship with Iran. Remember, Vladimir Putin took one of his first trips out of Russia during this time to Iran. And he has secured these drones that now are crashing into buildings in Ukraine and causing a lot of destruction and death. So that just shows you the nature of this relationship, this tight-knit relationship between these three forces, and one definitely to watch. There are some military exercises that Russia is going to be holding over the next several weeks. This is sort of a planned time when military exercises happen in Europe. NATO is also holding military exercises. There will be some overlap. This is always a little bit of a tense time because these military drills are meant to simulate war. And a miscalculation, something that goes wrong, a miscommunication, there's always that question of a broader conflict. So I want you to know that those military drills, at least on the NATO side, are beginning today, and we're going to be watching what happens on the Russian side. We're getting close to winter. And remember, winter presents a whole host of other obstacles, not only for Russia, if they continue their attacks on Ukraine, which we see to be likely, but also because of the colder weather. One note, just talking about the economy. The Economist has a fascinating article about Russia that they just published that basically showed that the Russian economy, after falling into recession, is still not doing well, but isn't doing as poorly as people thought. And it looks like the Russian consumers are coming back a little bit. They've been normalized during this conflict, and they're getting parts from other places besides Europe to continue their activity. This really mattered to me because if Russia's not in a dire economic strait, then they have the money to continue to fuel the war. And so we always have to watch that as well. Real quick here, I'm going to take you back to home. We covered a lot of ground, but I want to show you this real quick. One of the big stories back here that you'll likely see this week, and if you don't see it this week, we're going to be talking about it for sure on Monday, but we'd expect it, is some information about immigration. I showed you that chart earlier that shows for some voters, this is the number one issue for America. But broadly speaking, it's still the economy. However, the reason why this is really important and the data this month is going to be super important is it's going to conclude the year. So the government's fiscal year runs from October to September. And so that's the full year. So really the numbers we're going to get today in October for this month in October are going to be looking back on September. And that's the one missing piece. Once we get September's data, we'll not only know what happened last month, but we'll know what happened for the entire year. And that will give us a historic picture of what's happening at the US southern border. What you're seeing on your screen here is some of this available graphics just coming from Customs and Border Protection. And the two top lines, the yellow line and the blue line, are the two most recent years, the yellow being this year. And you can see very historic height of this graphic that's showing just how many encounters have happened at the US southern border. Remember, an encounter can be an arrest and a detainment. It could be someone seeking asylum that's eventually allowed to go free in America pursuing that claim. It could be a minor that's encountered at the border that's taken into government custody. Someone can be encountered more than once. So this is one of the reasons why I'm not going to say there's 2 million people that have been encountered at the US southern border. I'm going to say there's 2 million encounters because there's been some repeats. And I hope to get a little bit more perspective on that this week. So just expect there to be a lot of news about this coming out, because we'll be able to finally say, we can already say it's a historic year at the border with the number of encounters for US Border Patrol. But now we're going to be able to really put numbers behind it. And for looking at just politics, just, through the lens of politics for a moment, you're going to get the border data. Then you're going to get another data point next week on GDP, which will give us an indication about a recession, or raise more questions about if a recession is going to be called. And these two things are happening right before the midterm elections. So this is really important news and actual information coming out on both of them. So I want you to be aware of that. So we had a couple great questions from you this week, and I'm going to extend some of the questions because some of them were so good. I want to give you more of a thoughtful response. But Amy Park, you had a great question about how to navigate fact checking during this time, especially if you're wary of listening, if you don't have a couple hours a day to listen to one news channel and then another, and then cross compare and contrast what you've heard and see what you think, which I totally understand. Hopefully we're cleaning some of that up for you. Where can you go for fact checking that you feel is not politically motivated? And I just wanted to mention one place that I find really helpful. It's PolitiFact. And they will take any sort of claim, either online or something by a politician, and they'll work through it. Every once in a while, I'll look through some of their headlines, and it'll make me, and I think you'll see this, you'll read through it and you'll get kind of like there's some topics that they're tackling the big stuff, but they're using actual words from people to then enter into a more broad conversation. They usually have a lot of great data. So if you want to check out something that you think could be, worth your time, I would definitely check out PolitiFact. I'll make sure that it's linked as well here so that you're able to see it. And again, one of the things they just did, they took a look at abortion, and then they took a look at the Georgia Senate candidates and their recent debate. So they'll do a lot of different things. And I think that might be a good resource for you going into what's going to just get a little bit more tense as we get it's going to get a little bit more tense for now. But I feel like I could say that at any point. So I want to just finish up here with it was kind of a breaking news story, a little bit pop culture-y, but I don't know. I'll let you guys decide what you think about this. Do you know this band, BTS? They're from South Korea. They're a K-pop group. They're a pop group. Okay. It was just a huge phenomenon. These guys are superstars in their own country, but really around the world. They had a huge hit in the United States. I believe I read, let me see if I could pull that up. It was one of the first K-pop groups, South Korean K-pop groups, to ever make it into the Billboard 100. Here they are at the White House. So they've obviously made it if you're in the press briefing room at the White House. So there they are. The news today on them is in South Korea, you have to serve in the military, usually 18 months, about 2 years. Every man needs to serve in the military. And there's been a big question about whether or not they would do this because they are of age and they haven't done it yet. And they've deferred, which is possible. You can do that. But the announcement today is that the eldest one is going to go into military service, and he is going to start that. And then the rest of the band members are going to also do that. I think there were some things, other things that were happening with the band, that they were taking a break. It's all the gossip. But this was the big news today, that really the group is saying, we're going to take a pause because of military service. We're going to do our military service and we'll get back together in 2025. So they're at the height of their fame, really the height of their fame. And they're making this decision. Their performance apparently this weekend was the final one for them for now. according to their record label. It made me think about what happened here in the United States at one time. This is Elvis. He was drafted into the military. You can see him getting his famous haircut here. It was a really big deal. He was actually offered, I just did a little bit of quick reading on this. He was actually offered, I want to say maybe a more appealing position, from different branches of government. And he's like, no, I got drafted. I'm just going to go serve what I needed to do and serve my country. And one of the things that he said, I thought this was a great quote. He said, the Army teaches boys to think like men. Sergeant Elvis Presley, U.S. Army. So just have a quick picture of him. And what the Army says, and maybe the Navy would have something to say about this. The Army and the Navy, they kind of go at each other a little bit in a friendly way. One of the most famous draftees in American history is Elvis Presley. So there's precedent for this, but I thought it was interesting news to see some big pop stars from another country going through that same debate of how do we serve, what's the right thing to do, what's actually best for the country, and you see them make that sort of decision. So we'll keep an eye on that. And I wonder also what it says just about the state of the world. If the state of the world was different, would that be happening? Do they feel that way? Because, for example, we just covered over the last several weeks, you have that pressure from North Korea and these missiles that were fired very, in a way that was very antagonistic to South Korea. If that also just sort of created the environment for these young men to say, you know what, maybe it's time. And so just a story to watch. I hope you have enjoyed this. Again, we've covered a lot of ground from the U.S. economy to what's happening in China, Iran, Russia, and beyond. We'll continue to watch some of the big news items for this week and keep you posted. If we get any sort of developing news like we did last week about the subpoena of former President Trump, we'll jump on. I'll create an extra report for you. That's what I kind of want to do, start getting in the flow. This is just at the beginning of all of this. So really appreciate your support, your feedback, and keep the questions coming. Those really help direct us editorially, and we want to make sure that we're serving you in the best way possible because we know what you've been through. And we want to be with you wherever we're going next. So thank you so much. And we'll have more on smarternews.com. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.